Okay, so ever get the feeling that businesses can just kind of, do whatever they want, like it's a free-for-all out there?
Well, not quite.
Right. Someone's got to be keeping things in check.
Definitely. There's a whole army of people behind the scenes, especially in fields like, healthcare or finance, making sure everything's above board.
Right. And today, we're diving into that world, putting on our detective hats and figuring out what it takes to be a regulatory affairs manager.
Ooh, I like that, detective hats.
And we're using some really interesting data from RoleCatcher for this deep dive. They're a platform that claims to give job seekers, a leg up in the job market, a little bit of an insider's edge.
Yeah, they're kind of they're like the sheriffs of the corporate world, right? But instead of six shooters, they've got a deep understanding of all the laws and regulations.
So less Wild West showdown, more like
Mm.
intense boardroom negotiations.
Yeah, exactly. More like making sure that a company's products or services, whatever they're putting out there, actually complies with all those crazy complex rules that are out there.
Oh, for sure. And those rules can get pretty intense, especially when you think about, you know, like medical devices.
Right. And RoleCatcher actually uses that as an example, a medical device. Like imagine a regulatory affairs manager would be all over that process from the initial design, making sure it's safe, all the way through to getting FDA approval.
Wow. Talk about high stakes. So it's way more than just paperwork, huh?
Yeah, that's what I always thought, like pushing papers, ticking
Right.
boxes.
But this sounds like they're really in the thick of it.
Yeah, they're definitely dealing with documentation for sure, but it's not just about, filing forms, it's about understanding why those forms exist in the first place. What's the impact? They're like this bridge between, a company's desire to innovate, to create something new, and the need to keep consumers safe.
Right. Which is a delicate balance.
Totally. A delicate balance, and it takes a lot of expertise to, navigate that.
And probably a fair amount of stress too, right? I mean, we're
Yeah.
talking about, legal documents, regulations, all that jargon. It's a lot.
Oh, absolutely.
RoleCatcher even points out that 61% of the job relies on like really strong reading comprehension.
Hmm.
And this isn't, skimming through a magazine. We're talking serious legal documents here.
Oh, yeah, you got to be able to dissect those documents, understand all those little nuances, and figure out how they apply to a specific product or service. But, and here's the kicker, that's just the beginning.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
There's more.
Oh, yeah.
Because, the world of regulations, it's not static. New laws pop up, guidelines change, even the technology's always evolving.
So you can't just memorize a rule book and call it a day,
Nope.
which explains why RoleCatcher found that active learning, being a constant learner, is the second most important skill at 55%.
Right, absolutely. If you're not constantly reading, researching, keeping up with the latest, you're already behind.
It sounds like a pretty intense field.
It definitely keeps you on your toes.
So it's a high-pressure job. There's always something new to learn. But RoleCatcher also mentions a really positive job outlook. So what makes this field so hot right now? So it's a high-pressure job. There's always something new to learn. But RoleCatcher also mentions a really positive job outlook. So what makes this field so hot right now?
Well, think about it. Practically every industry out there, they've got rules to follow.
Right, from healthcare to finance, tech, even manufacturing.
Exactly. They all need someone who can, guide them through that regulatory maze.
So it's not just about knowing the rules, it's about being able to apply them, across the board.
Absolutely.
And speaking of which, RoleCatcher actually maps out a typical career path in this field, starting with, the associate level.
Right. So at that stage, you're laying the groundwork, You're digging into the regulations, getting those documents prepped, making sure everything's in order, just in case there's an inspection.
Oh, man, talk about pressure.
Yeah, RoleCatcher actually, they compare it to being a detective, which I kind of love.
A detective, I can see that.
Yeah, you're searching for details, connecting the dots, making sure your company's in line.
Because one little mistake could mean, huge fines.
Oh, for sure. Even legal trouble.
Wow. So, high stakes from the get-go. But for someone who's really organized, who kind of thrives under pressure, sounds like a good place to start.
Definitely. It's all about building that foundation.
Right. So let's say you've, conquered the world of regulatory paperwork. What's next? What's the next step up the ladder?
Well, you might find yourself moving into a more specialized role. Like, focusing on a specific area. Could be something like clinical trials if you're in pharmaceuticals, or, data privacy in the tech world.
Oh, so you get to really niche down and become an expert in a certain area.
Exactly. And now you're not just following the rules, you're actually helping to shape your company's regulatory strategy.
Okay, so less detective, more like that strategic advisor.
Exactly. You're anticipating challenges, thinking ahead, figuring out how to keep your company ahead of the curve.
That's a good way to put it.
Mm,
And of course, if you're really killing it in that role, you could end up managing a whole team, right?
right. As a regulatory affairs manager.
Which, by the way, RoleCatcher has some really interesting profiles of people in these roles. Like, there's one manager they highlight, they have a master's degree, and they're like overseeing the entire regulatory process for this whole line of medical devices. So
Mhm.
clearly, experience and education are key to moving up.
Oh, for sure. But remember all that active learning we were talking about?
Never stops, does it?
Nope. Because those senior regulatory affairs managers, they're often the ones advising. Like the top executives, they're shaping company policies, even influencing industry standards.
Wow. Now we're talking about the big leagues. They're not just navigating the rules, they're
Mhm.
actually helping to create them.
Exactly.
That's wild. RoleCatcher even mentions, like, professionals at this level presenting at international conferences or even, like, developing training programs for others in the field.
It's definitely a far cry from just filing paperwork.
So we've gone from meticulous detective to strategic advisor to, like, industry influencer. It's a pretty impressive career trajectory.
It is.
But it's not all about, climbing the corporate ladder, right?
Right.
Because RoleCatcher also touches on something really important, which is the ethical dilemmas that regulatory affairs managers often face.
Yeah.
Like we talked about balancing company profits with consumer safety, but what happens when the rules themselves aren't clear or they're open to interpretation?
That's where things get really interesting. Imagine, for example, a company that's developing, I don't know, self-driving cars. That's a good one.
Oh, yeah, that's a hot topic.
Right. And the regulations around that, they're still being figured out. There's a lot of gray area.
So what's a regulatory affairs manager to do in that situation? Just throw up their hands and say, hey, no rules, anything goes.
Definitely not. That's where their expertise and their judgment come into play. They have to really weigh the risks and benefits, talk to experts, and then, make a call based on what they believe is the most ethical and responsible course of action.
Wow, that's a heavy burden. One wrong move could have major consequences.
For sure.
Does RoleCatcher, like, dive into any real-life examples of this?
They don't, provide a step-by-step guide because every ethical dilemma is different.
All right, there's no playbook for that.
Exactly. But they do stress how important it is to really understand the potential impact of your work,
Right.
Asking those tough questions, challenging assumptions, and most importantly, speaking up if something doesn't feel right.
Which brings us right back to that sheriff analogy.
Mhm.
They're not just there to enforce the law, they're there to uphold a sense of what's right,
Absolutely.
even when it's hard. That takes a certain kind of person, don't you think?
Absolutely. Integrity, courage, a strong moral compass, those are all essential. But you also need that deep understanding of the industry and the ability to think critically to solve problems.
So it sounds like a career in regulatory affairs. It's not for the faint of heart, but for those who are up for the challenge.
It can be incredibly rewarding.
Definitely. And speaking of rewarding, let's talk a little bit about RoleCatcher itself, because they claim to offer all these tools that can really give job seekers an edge in this competitive market. It's almost like they're walking this tightrope,
Totally.
between making sure their company's profitable, but also keeping the public safe.
It's a tough job.
It really is. So where does RoleCatcher, like, play into all of this? Do they offer any guidance for navigating those ethical gray areas we were talking about?
Well, they don't give you a step-by-step, like ethics for dummies kind of thing.
Right, because it's not always that simple.
Exactly. Ethics are tricky. But they do highlight how crucial it is to have, professional integrity and to really think about the big picture. Like, what are the consequences of your decisions? And one thing they do offer is this database. It's massive, full of interview questions.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and it's broken down by role, including regulatory affairs.
So if you're prepping for an interview in this field, you could use RoleCatcher to, like, anticipate those tough questions about ethics, compliance, all of that.
Exactly. It's like a practice run before the big game, They might not have all the answers, but it definitely gets you thinking.
That's a great way to put it. But even with all the prep in the world, you're bound to run into situations where, the rules aren't clear, or there's no easy answer.
Right.
What advice would you give someone facing that kind of ethical dilemma in their work?
Honestly, Trust your gut.
Really?
Yeah, if something feels off, it probably is. Don't be afraid to, ask questions, talk to people, get different perspectives. You can even challenge the status quo.
That's easier said than done sometimes.
It is, it is. But remember, you're not alone in this. There are organizations, mentors, even online communities where you can find support, people who've been there.
That's so important because it's easy to feel like you have to have it all figured out, especially when you're in that kind of position.
Right, like you've got to have all the answers.
Exactly. So having those resources, that support system, it can make all the difference.
Absolutely. And never underestimate the power of documentation.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah, if you've raised concerns, made recommendations, anything like that, put it in writing.
Cover yourself.
Exactly.
That's good advice for anyone, really.
Oh, absolutely.
But yeah, especially in a field like this where the stakes are so high.
Totally.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap things up, don't you?
I think so, yeah.
So, to our listeners who are thinking about a career in regulatory affairs, just remember, it's challenging for sure, but it's also incredibly rewarding. And for those of you who are just, curious about how the world works, about all those behind-the-scenes forces that shape our lives, we hope this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for what regulatory affairs managers do. They might not wear capes.
But they're kind of superheroes.
They really are. They're out there fighting the good fight, making sure things are done right, one regulation at a time.